This doesn't look like abuse. Why intelligent women don't see it coming? What if the most dangerous relationships don't begin with cruelty, but with clarity? What if the man who eventually dismantles your sense of self is the same one who once made you feel profoundly seen? And what if the reason you stayed wasn't weakness, but intelligence? Emily had always trusted her mind. She was articulate, emotionally literate, and deeply self-aware. She read the books, went to therapy, believed in growth. Abuse, in her imagination, was loud. It had sharp edges, raised voices, broken things, fear that announced itself unmistakably. This did not look like that. This looked like chemistry, like fate, like depth. It began with conversations that felt unusually precise, as if he had tuned into a frequency no one else could hear. He listened not casually, but intensely. He remembered what mattered to her. He spoke the language of insight. He didn't rush her body, but he rushed her soul. And when he said, "I've never met anyone like you," it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like recognition. That was the first miscalculation. Because emotional abuse, especially narcissistic abuse, does not target the unaware. It targets the perceptive, the empathic, the women who believe that understanding is the highest form of love. Intelligent women don't ignore red flags. They reinterpret them. They assume complexity where there is manipulation. They assume trauma where there is entitlement. They assume that if something feels confusing, the answer must lie in deeper introspection. And so, instead of asking, "Why does this feel wrong?" they ask, "What am I missing?" Emily didn't fall because she was naive. She fell because she believed in nuance. She believed that people are layered. That intimacy takes work. That discomfort can be a sign of growth. And most dangerously, she believed that if she could just understand him better, everything would make sense. That's how the trap closes quietly. There was no moment she could point to and say, "This is where it turned." No single argument. No clear offense. Just a slow rearranging of emotional gravity. Conversations that left her feeling oddly smaller. Jokes that landed with a sting she couldn't explain. Subtle disappointments disguised as honesty. And every time she felt unsettled, she did what intelligent women are trained to do. She reflected. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she expected too much. Maybe she needed to communicate more clearly. This is how emotional abuse survives so long without detection. It doesn't attack your strength. It recruits it. Narcissistic dynamics don't rely on dominance in the beginning. They rely on alignment, on mirroring your values, your dreams, your wounds, until you feel like you've met someone who finally gets it. Someone safe enough to lower your guard around. But here is the part no one tells you. Safety that is rushed is not safety. It is strategy. When intimacy accelerates faster than trust can form, discernment doesn't have time to breathe. The brain floods with chemistry. The body bonds. The story writes itself before you've read the fine print. Emily mistook intensity for intimacy, like so many intelligent women do. She didn't notice the shift at first. The way she started explaining herself a little more. The way she felt compelled to justify her feelings. The way she began editing her reactions before they ever left her mouth. It didn't feel like self-betrayal. It felt like emotional maturity. That's the most insidious part. Emotional abuse doesn't announce itself as danger. It presents itself as a challenge for the capable, a puzzle for the insightful, a relationship that requires your very best emotional skills to navigate. And when something feels off, the intelligent woman doesn't leave. She leans in. She studies. She adapts. She gives the benefit of the doubt long after doubt itself has become a constant companion. Emily told herself that love wasn't always easy. That real connection demanded patience. That people with depth also have shadows. What she didn't see until much later was that she was the only one doing the emotional labor, the only one bending, the only one questioning herself. And by the time the word abuse even crossed her mind, it felt too dramatic to apply. Because nothing looked broken. Nothing was screaming. Except her nervous system. If you're listening to this and feeling a quiet recognition tighten in your chest, hear this clearly. The absence of chaos does not mean the presence of health. Confusion is not a personal failing. It is often the first symptom of emotional manipulation. This doesn't look like abuse because it was never meant to. It was meant to look like love, just unstable enough to keep you trying, just ambiguous enough to keep you doubting yourself, and just intoxicating enough to make leaving feel unthinkable. And if this story already feels uncomfortably familiar, you're going to want to stay until the end, because the ending is not what you've been taught to expect. Before we continue, if this resonates with you even a little, please subscribe to the channel. It tells the algorithm that this conversation matters. And it helps us keep creating honest, grounded content about emotional health, relationships, and healing. Now, let me ask you a quick question, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Question: when something feels wrong in a relationship, which do you instinctively do first? A. You look inward and ask what you might be doing wrong. E. You pause and observe patterns before taking responsibility. Comment A or B below. Your answer might reveal more than you think. The Narcissist Decoder. Part I. The charm is the hook. If emotional abuse had a signature scent, it wouldn't smell like fear. It would smell like possibility. Emily didn't feel hunted. She felt chosen. The charm didn't arrive as bravado or ego. It arrived as precision. The kind that feels flattering because it's rare. He didn't dominate conversations. He curated them. He didn't interrupt. He listened, and then responded in ways that felt uncannily aligned. It wasn't that he talked about himself too much. It was that he talked about her ideas, her values, the parts of her that had never quite found a mirror in someone else. Charm, at this level, doesn't announce itself as charm. It disguises itself as attunement. He remembered details that mattered, not the obvious ones, but the small, unglamorous truths people usually forget. A childhood disappointment, a private ambition, a line she once said she loved from a book. When Emily noticed this, she didn't think, "This is intentional." She thought, "This is rare." That's how the hook slides in through meaning. Narcissistic charm is not random magnetism. It is targeted connection. It studies before it seduces. It learns your emotional grammar and then speaks it fluently. Not to know you, but to position itself as indispensable to you. In the early days, everything felt elevated. Conversations didn't skim the surface. They plunged. He spoke about growth, authenticity, self-work. He framed intensity as honesty and urgency as passion. And because Emily valued depth, she mistook acceleration for sincerity. Speed felt like destiny. When he said, "I feel like I've known you forever," it landed as intimacy, not invasion. When he wanted to spend more time together than she'd planned, it felt flattering, not consuming. Boundaries blurred quietly, politely, under the banner of connection. This is where charm does its most effective work. It bypasses caution by appealing to values. Emily didn't ignore her instincts. She overruled them with reason. Every flicker of doubt had a plausible explanation. He was enthusiastic, emotionally open. Finally, someone who didn't play games. And yet, beneath the glow, something else was happening. The charm wasn't just warmth, it was calibration. He mirrored her beliefs so completely that disagreement felt almost unnecessary. When she spoke about what mattered to her, he nodded not just in agreement, but in identity. As if he had always been standing right where she was, waiting for her to arrive. This wasn't compatibility. It was reflection. Mirroring creates the illusion of sameness, and sameness creates trust. Trust invites disclosure. And disclosure in the wrong hands, becomes leverage. Emily began to share more than she usually would, more quickly than she normally did. Not because she felt pressured, but because it felt safe. He held her stories gently. He validated her experiences. He framed her sensitivity as insight, her independence as strength. That's another common misunderstanding. That narcissistic charm flatters ego. He didn't tell Emily she was perfect. He told her she was profound. And because the validation was specific, it felt earned. It felt like being recognized rather than praised. Compliments that are vague can be dismissed. Compliments that feel diagnostic sink deep. This is not accidental. The narcissistic hook is not about making you feel superior. It's about making you feel understood in a way that feels irreplaceable. The effect on the nervous system is subtle but powerful. Dopamine surges with novelty. Oxytocin rises with perceived safety. The body begins to associate emotional closeness with relief. Logic doesn't disappear, but it softens. Questions feel less urgent. Discernment feels almost unkind. Why interrogate something that feels this good? And so, the charm continues not relentlessly, but rhythmically. Enough space to seem respectful. Enough attention to stay central. He wasn't always available, which made his presence feel earned. He was selective, which made Emily feel chosen again. Charm, at this stage, is not excess. It is control through contrast. What Emily didn't see was how the frame had already been set, how the relationship had been defined early on as exceptional, intense, and meaningful. Once that story takes hold, everything that follows is filtered through it. Confusion becomes complexity. Hurt becomes miscommunication. Doubt becomes personal failure. Because if this connection is special, then problems must be solvable. Charm also creates witnesses. Friends who meet him see the polished version, the attentive listener, the thoughtful partner. This matters later. Because when the tone shifts behind closed doors, Emily won't just doubt herself, she'll wonder why no one else sees it. That's part of the design. The charm phase is not separate from the harm. It is the groundwork that makes the harm possible. It establishes credibility. It builds emotional debt. It creates a narrative that says, this is different. This is worth fighting for. And for intelligent women especially, that narrative is compelling. Because intelligence seeks coherence. It wants stories to make sense. It wants depth to be rewarded. It wants effort to matter. Charm, in the narcissistic dynamic, is not about love. It is about access. Access to your inner world. Your fears. Your hopes. Your need to believe that connection can be both intense and safe. Emily didn't realize that the relationship had already tilted before anything overtly painful occurred. The center of gravity had shifted. His perception mattered more than hers. His reactions carried more weight. His approval became a quiet reference point, not because he demanded it, but because the charm had taught her to value it. And that is the most dangerous hook of all. When you begin to trust someone else's understanding of you more than your own. The charm phase doesn't end abruptly. It thins. It becomes inconsistent. And when it does, the memory of how it once felt becomes the reason you stay. Because you don't think you were manipulated. You think something meaningful has been temporarily misplaced. That's the lie charm leaves behind. It convinces you that the problem is distance from the beginning, rather than clarity about it. And once you're chasing a feeling, instead of evaluating a pattern, the hook has done its job. The slow erasure. When you start editing yourself, no one tells you that the most devastating changes don't arrive as explosions. They arrive as adjustments. Emily couldn't point to a single moment when she changed. There was no clear before and after, no dramatic rupture, just a gradual tightening inside her chest, a growing awareness that she was thinking more before she spoke, Not because she wanted to be careful, but because she wanted to be safe. At first, it felt reasonable. She told herself she was learning how to communicate better, that every relationship required compromise, that choosing her battles was a sign of emotional maturity. When something bothered her, she'd pause and ask herself whether it was worth bringing up. When she did speak, she softened her language, trimmed the edges, removed anything that might sound like criticism. This didn't feel like self-silencing. It felt like refinement. But over time, the pauses got longer. The edits more frequent. The things she decided weren't worth it started to include parts of herself that used to feel essential. Emily stopped sharing thoughts in real time. She rehearsed conversations in her head, imagining how he might react, recalibrating her words to land more gently. She learned which topics made him withdraw, which ones provoked irritation, which ones earned approval. Without realizing it, she began organizing her inner life around his emotional weather. This is how erasure begins, not with force, but with accommodation. There were moments she caught herself mid-sentence, pivoting away from what she actually felt. Moments she swallowed disappointment before it reached her mouth. She told herself it was kindness, empathy, love. But love does not require disappearance. The cost showed up quietly. Emily felt more tired than she should have. Not physically exhausted, emotionally depleted. Her creativity dulled. Things that once brought her joy felt distant, as if she were observing her own life through glass. She laughed less freely. She felt a constant low-grade tension, like she was bracing for something she couldn't quite name. This wasn't sadness. It was vigilance. Hypervigilance is what happens when your nervous system learns that unpredictability lives close to intimacy. You don't know when the mood will shift, when warmth will cool, when neutrality will turn sharp. So you scan, you adjust, you try to stay one step ahead. Emily began budgeting her emotions. She conserved energy during the day so she could handle evenings better. She saved enthusiasm for moments that felt safe. She avoided bringing her full self into the room, just in case it might be too much. No one asked her to do this outright. That's what made it so confusing. There were no ultimatums, no overt demands, just subtle signals that some versions of her were more welcome than others. When she was agreeable, things were smooth. When she was questioning, things grew tense. When she was expressive, things became complicated. So she learned. She became smaller in ways that were almost invisible to the outside world. Friends still saw her as capable, thoughtful, composed. But inside, she felt like she was shrinking to fit a space that kept changing shape. The most dangerous part was that she blamed herself for the discomfort. She told herself she was overthinking, that she needed to regulate better, that maybe this was what adult relationships looked like: less spontaneity, more consideration. But consideration without reciprocity is not maturity. It's self-abandonment. Emily began to notice a strange pattern. Whenever she expressed a need, the conversation shifted toward his feelings, his stress, his frustration, his disappointment. Somehow, her vulnerability always seemed to create inconvenience, and so she started preemptively minimizing her needs to avoid becoming a burden. This is how people disappear while still being present. She didn't lose her voice overnight. She misplaced it, piece by piece. Each time she chose harmony over honesty. Each time she told herself it wasn't a big deal. Each time she swallowed a reaction because she didn't want to make things harder. And yet, things kept feeling hard. There is a specific grief that comes with this stage, a grief for the self you remember being. The woman who spoke freely, who trusted her instincts, who didn't feel the need to earn emotional safety. Emily would catch glimpses of that version of herself in old messages, old photos, old conversations. She didn't recognize her as reckless or immature. She recognized her as alive. That recognition hurt. because it forced a question she wasn't ready to answer. When did I decide that being understood mattered more than being real? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was practical. She decided it every time she chose peace over truth, without realizing that peace built on self-erasure is not peace at all. It's containment. And containment always has a cost. Her body felt it first. Tight shoulders, shallow breaths, a persistent sense of unease that followed her even when nothing was wrong. She couldn't relax fully, even in quiet moments. Something in her stayed alert, listening for emotional cues. This is what happens when your inner world is no longer yours alone. Emily wasn't weak. She was adaptive. She was skilled at reading people, at adjusting to environments, at maintaining connection. These traits had served her well in life. But here, they were being used against her. The relationship didn't ask her to become someone else. It asked her to become less. Less expressive. Less certain. Less demanding. Less visible. And because the changes were incremental, she didn't resist them. She rationalized them. She told herself she was growing. Growth, however, expands you. It does not compress you. The slow erasure is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. From the inside, everything feels slightly misaligned. You start to miss yourself without knowing exactly who you're missing. Emily didn't wake up one day knowing she had disappeared. She woke up knowing she was tired of pretending she hadn't. That awareness didn't free her yet. But it planted a question she could no longer ignore. What if the problem wasn't who she was becoming, but who she was having to stop being in order to stay? Once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. It waits. And eventually, it demands an answer. Gaslighting. Without the drama. How reality gets rewritten. Gaslighting doesn't usually arrive as a lie you can point to. It arrives as a feeling you can't quite explain. Emily didn't experience arguments that ended with slammed doors or raised voices. There were no dramatic denials, no cartoonish distortions of events. What she experienced was subtler and far more destabilizing. Conversations that left her unsure of what had just happened. Moments where her emotional footing slipped, even though the ground looked solid. She would bring up something small, a comment that hurt, a moment that felt dismissive, not accusing, just honest. And he wouldn't explode. He would pause, tilt his head, look confused, sometimes amused, sometimes disappointed. "I think you're reading into this," he'd say. "That's not how it happened. You're making a big deal out of nothing." None of these statements are overtly cruel. That's why they're so effective. Gaslighting at this level doesn't try to convince you that the sky is green. It tries to convince you that your reaction to the sky is irrational, that your perception is distorted, that your emotional response is evidence of a flaw in you, not a problem in the interaction. And because Emily valued accuracy, she listened. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for where she might have misunderstood. She considered his perspective. She wondered if stress, fatigue, or her own sensitivity had colored the moment. By the time the conversation ended, she was often apologizing not for what he did, but for how she felt about it. This is how reality begins to tilt. The most disorienting part was that he never framed himself as right. He framed her as mistaken. He didn't say, "I didn't do that." He said, "That's not what I meant." He didn't deny her feelings outright. He questioned their validity. The result wasn't conflict. It was confusion. Confusion is the core symptom of gaslighting. Not fear, not rage, confusion. Emily started leaving conversations feeling foggy, unsure why she felt bad, unsure what she was supposed to fix. She would think, "I walked into this feeling clear. Why do I feel so scrambled now?" The answer never seemed to land anywhere solid. Gaslighting works because it doesn't attack memory directly. It attacks confidence in memory. It doesn't say, "You're wrong." It says, "Are you sure?" And over time, that question lodges itself inside you. Emily began second-guessing her instincts. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to hesitate, just enough to doubt. When something felt off, she no longer trusted that feeling as information. She treated it as a problem to be managed. This is where gaslighting becomes internal. The voice questioning her reality didn't always come from him anymore. It came from inside her. She would catch herself thinking, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this is my issue. Maybe I need to work on this. This is not insight. This is erosion. In therapy, she struggled to articulate what was wrong. There was no single incident she could point to. No clear narrative. Just a pervasive sense that she was losing her grip on herself. She found herself asking the same question over and over. What's wrong with me? That question is not random. It is diagnostic. People in emotionally healthy relationships don't come to therapy confused about their own sanity. They come angry, hurt, grieving. But gaslighting reroutes all of that inward. It turns relational harm into self-doubt. Emily's therapist listened carefully, asking questions about patterns rather than events. That was when Emily realized how hard it was to answer simple things. What actually happened? What was said? How she felt in the moment. Everything felt slippery, like trying to hold water in her hands. Gaslighting doesn't erase reality. It makes it unstable. Another layer made it harder to name. His public persona. In social settings, he was composed, charming, considerate. Friends spoke highly of him. He listened. He showed up. He appeared thoughtful. This version of him existed comfortably in the world, which meant that when Emily felt dismissed or diminished in private, there was no external validation, no witness, no mirror. She began to wonder if she was the outlier. The problem. The one misinterpreting something everyone else seemed to understand. This isolation is not accidental. It's structural. Gaslighting thrives when there are no dissenting voices. When your inner experience is the only evidence you have and you've been taught not to trust it. Emily noticed that the rules of conversation had changed. Certain topics were off limits. Not explicitly, but emotionally. If she persisted, the atmosphere shifted. He became colder, more distant, sometimes quietly irritated, sometimes withdrawn. This taught her a lesson without words. Some truths come with consequences, and so she learned to avoid them. This is how gaslighting shapes behavior. It doesn't forbid you from speaking. It teaches you that speaking is unsafe. The rewriting of reality wasn't dramatic. It was incremental. Each time he reframed her concern as misunderstanding. Each time he positioned himself as reasonable, and her as reactive. Each time her clarity dissolved into apology. Over time, Emily stopped trusting her emotional responses altogether. She felt them, but she no longer believed they were valid. She treated them as distortions to be corrected, rather than signals to be honored. Her inner compass spun. The cruelty of gaslighting is not that it makes you believe lies. It's that it makes you abandon yourself as a reliable source of truth. Emily didn't lose touch with reality overnight. She lost her relationship with it. The sense that her perceptions mattered, that her feelings carried information, that her discomfort was worth examining, not dismissing. And because the gaslighting wasn't loud, she had no language for it. Nothing dramatic enough to justify the word abuse. Nothing obvious enough to warrant leaving. Just a growing sense that she was no longer standing on solid ground. What finally unsettled her wasn't a fight. It was a moment of clarity in its absence. She was alone one evening, replaying a conversation, when she realized she couldn't remember how it began. Only how it ended with her apologizing and feeling ashamed. She asked herself a question she had avoided for a long time. When was the last time I felt certain about my own experience? She couldn't remember. That realization didn't shatter her world. It cracked it open. Because gaslighting can only survive where there is silence. The moment you start naming your confusion, instead of blaming yourself for it, the spell weakens. Emily wasn't ready to confront him yet. She wasn't ready to leave. But she began to write things down. Not interpretations. Not feelings. Just facts. What was said. What happened. How the conversation ended. For the first time in a long while, the ground stopped moving. Reality didn't rush back, but it began to hold. And that quiet, steady, undeniable was the beginning of something he could no longer rewrite. Why leaving feels impossible, even when you know. Knowing something is wrong is not the same as being able to leave it. Emily knew long before she admitted it out loud that the relationship was costing her something vital. She felt it in her body before she could articulate it in words. The heaviness in her chest when she imagined another year like this. The quiet relief she felt when he wasn't around. The way her shoulders dropped when she was alone, as if her nervous system finally had permission to rest. And still, she stayed. This is the part of the story that outsiders misunderstand the most. The part reduced to a single, brutal question. If it was that bad, why didn't you just leave? The truth is, by the time the question makes sense to ask, leaving no longer feels like a simple choice. It feels like stepping off the edge of a cliff, without knowing whether there's ground below. Emily didn't stay because she didn't see the damage. She stayed because the damage had rewired the very systems she would have needed to escape. One of the most powerful forces keeping her there wasn't hope, it was fear. Not the obvious kind, but the quieter, more corrosive fear of being wrong. The fear that she was misinterpreting everything. That she would leave, only to realize she had overreacted. That she would destroy something meaningful because she couldn't handle complexity. This fear was not irrational. It had been carefully cultivated. In a dynamic where your perceptions are repeatedly questioned, certainty becomes dangerous. You learn that confidence leads to conflict. Doubt feels safer. So even when clarity flickers, you hesitate. You interrogate yourself harder than you ever interrogate the relationship. Emily asked herself questions that seemed responsible but functioned like chains. What if this is as good as it gets? What if every relationship has this phase? What if I'm the common denominator? And beneath those questions was an even deeper one she barely allowed herself to touch. What if I leave, and I'm alone? Loneliness is not just the absence of people, it is the absence of narrative. Leaving meant not only losing him, but losing the story she had been living inside the idea that this connection, however painful, had meaning, that it was leading somewhere, that it would eventually resolve. Letting go of that story felt like failure. Another force held her in place. Memory. Not the full memory of the relationship, but a curated one. The beginning. The intensity. The version of him who once seemed gentle and attuned. That version became a kind of emotional anchor. A reference point she kept returning to whenever the present felt unbearable. Trauma bonding thrives on this split perception. The brain clings to intermittent reward with extraordinary loyalty. When kindness appears unpredictably, it feels more valuable, not less. Each moment of warmth carries the promise that the relationship can return to what it once was. Emily wasn't chasing him. She was chasing the feeling of herself that existed in those early moments. Leaving felt like giving up on that version of herself forever. There were practical barriers too, though she rarely named them out loud. Emotional energy is finite, and she had already spent so much of it managing the relationship. The thought of disentangling, explaining, moving, grieving, rebuilding felt overwhelming. Exhaustion can masquerade as choice. Sometimes staying feels easier not because it hurts less, but because you have no strength left to imagine something else. Emily also felt responsible for him in ways that were difficult to explain. Not because he needed her, but because he had positioned himself as wounded, misunderstood, stressed. Leaving felt cruel, as if she were abandoning someone who was already struggling. This is one of the most insidious inversions in emotionally abusive dynamics. The person being harmed feels like the one who must protect. She worried about how he would cope, how he would talk about her, how she would be seen. The idea of becoming the villain in someone else's story terrified her. She had spent so long trying to be fair, reasonable, understanding. Walking away felt like a betrayal of her own values. What she didn't yet see was that those values had been weaponized. Another layer kept her frozen. Loss aversion. The human mind is wired to fear loss more than it values gain. Leaving meant losing not only the relationship, but the time she had invested, the emotional labor she had poured in, the future she had imagined. Starting over felt unbearable not because she couldn't do it, but because it meant admitting that everything she had endured hadn't led where she thought it would. There is a specific grief in realizing that suffering does not always produce growth. Sometimes, it just produces scars. Emily feared that if she left, all that pain would become meaningless. And then there was the fear no one talks about openly. The fear that someone else would get the better version of him. That she would leave, do the hard work, carry the wounds, and someone else would benefit from her sacrifice. This fear is deeply human. It strikes at the core of fairness. It whispers, what if the problem really was me? What if he changes for her? 1. The truth that patterns repeat, that dynamics transfer, that change requires accountability, was intellectually available to Emily. Emotionally, it was inaccessible, because emotional truth lags behind intellectual understanding in trauma-bonded relationships. She also feared the aftermath, the silence, the empty space where constant emotional monitoring used to be. Even pain can feel safer than the unknown when it has become familiar. The relationship had taken over so much internal space that imagining life without it felt disorienting. Who would she be if she wasn't constantly adjusting, analyzing, anticipating? Who would she be without the struggle? When relationships like this end, they don't leave a void, they leave a vacuum. And vacuums are terrifying. Emily noticed something else that surprised her. The idea of leaving made her feel guilty, not relieved. Guilty, as if she were abandoning a responsibility, as if staying was proof of loyalty, and leaving was proof of selfishness. This guilt didn't come from her values, it came from conditioning. Over time, she had been trained to associate her needs with disruption, her boundaries with rejection, her clarity with harm. Of course, leaving felt wrong. It violated the internal rules she had learned to survive. This is why knowing is not enough. Insight does not automatically undo attachment. Awareness does not immediately restore agency. The nervous system moves at a different pace than the mind. Emily had moments of resolve. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she imagined packing a bag. She imagined saying the words. And then morning would come, and the weight of reality would settle back in. The relationship would resume its rhythm, and the urgency would fade. She judged herself harshly for this. She told herself she was weak, indecisive, afraid. What she didn't understand yet was that her hesitation was not a failure of courage. It was a signal of how deeply the dynamic had embedded itself. Leaving requires more than recognizing harm. It requires a felt sense that you deserve safety, even if it costs you everything familiar. Emily wasn't there yet. And that matters. Because healing does not begin with action. It begins with permission. Permission to name the truth without immediately acting on it. Permission to grieve what is being lost. Permission to acknowledge how hard this actually is. The culture around "just leave" skips this entirely. It treats departure as a moral test instead of a neurological and emotional process. It shames people for staying without understanding what staying costs them every day. Emily stayed longer than she thought she should. Not because she didn't value herself, but because she was still disentangling her worth from the relationship. The first real shift didn't come when she decided to leave. It came when she stopped, forcing herself to decide. She began asking different questions. Not, why can't I leave? But, what do I need in order to feel safe enough to choose myself? That question changed everything. It allowed her to see staying not as a failure, but as information. It allowed her to treat her fear with compassion instead of contempt. It allowed her to move at the pace of her nervous system, not her shame. Leaving would come later. But first, Emily needed to stop punishing herself for surviving. And in that gentler space, something began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The impossible slowly became imaginable. And that, in relationships like this, is the first real freedom. The Narcissist Decoder, Part 2, Patterns Don't Lie. The moment Emily stopped asking why and started asking how often, everything changed. For a long time, she had been trying to understand the relationship as a series of isolated moments. One argument here, one apology there, one good week that seemed to cancel out the bad one before it. She kept hoping that if she could find the right explanation, stress, timing, miscommunication, the confusion would dissolve. It never did. Clarity didn't arrive as an emotional breakthrough. It arrived as a pattern. Patterns don't announce themselves dramatically. They repeat quietly, waiting for you to stop explaining them away. Emily began noticing the rhythm of the relationship instead of its highlights. The same cycle appeared again and again, regardless of the topic. When she brought up something that mattered to her, the initial response was often deflection. If she persisted, the tone shifted cooler, sharper, more distant. Eventually, there would be a partial apology, carefully worded, just enough to reset the dynamic without changing it. The content of the conflict changed. The structure did not. This was the first truth she couldn't unsee. Outcomes mattered more than intentions. And the outcome was always the same. She felt smaller, quieter, less certain than when the conversation began. Patterns reveal what words are designed to hide. Emily also began noticing the contrast between who he was in public and who he was in private. In social settings, he was attentive, articulate, generous with praise. Friends admired him. They spoke about how lucky she was. They saw the version of him that validated her choice to stay. Behind closed doors, things felt different. Not overtly cruel, just subtly dismissive. Neutral moments carried tension. Warmth felt conditional. Affection appeared and disappeared without explanation. This split created a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being unseen while surrounded by people. When Emily tried to describe what felt wrong, her words sounded thin even to her own ears. There was no obvious wrongdoing to point to, just a steady drip of disconnection. This is why patterns are so important. Individual moments can be dismissed. Repetition cannot. She started documenting not emotionally, but observationally. Dates, conversations, what was said, how she felt afterward. She resisted the urge to interpret. She wrote only what happened and what followed. At first, this felt excessive, almost accusatory. But slowly, something remarkable happened. The fog lifted. The same dynamics appeared on the page over and over. Her needs were reframed as demands. Her concerns became evidence of instability. His apologies rarely included accountability. Change was promised, but never sustained. This wasn't a rough patch. It was a design. Patterns don't require you to diagnose someone. They don't ask you to label, analyze, or explain. They simply ask you to observe. Emily realized that she had spent months, maybe years, giving the relationship the benefit of the doubt. She had assumed good faith. She had assumed mutual growth. She had assumed that effort would eventually lead to repair. But patterns told a different story. Effort flowed in one direction. Repair was temporary. Accountability was absent. Another truth surfaced quietly. When people are capable of empathy, it is consistent. When empathy appears only when it serves them, it is not empathy at all. It is strategy. Emily noticed how quickly compassion appeared when he feared losing her, and how quickly it vanished once stability returned. The emotional responsiveness she longed for was not unavailable. It was conditional. This was painful to see, not because it was shocking, but because it was confirming. Patterns also clarified something else she had resisted, acknowledging. The relationship did not improve with time. It circled. It reset. It returned to the same emotional coordinates again and again. There is a deep relief in recognizing patterns, even when they are painful. Because patterns remove the burden of self-blame. They answer the question that has haunted you for so long. Is this me, or is this real? It was real. Emily didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to him, not to friends, not even to herself. The evidence was not dramatic, but it was consistent. And consistency is the language of truth. She also began to see how apologies functioned in the relationship. They were rarely about understanding her experience. They were about restoring equilibrium, ending discomfort, moving on. They sounded sincere, but they didn't come with curiosity or change. Remorse without responsibility is not repair. Patterns exposed this too. Another realization followed. The relationship depended on her continued flexibility, her willingness to adapt, to soften, to let things go. The system functioned only because she kept it running. When she imagined what would happen if she stopped doing that, if she held her ground consistently, if she stopped absorbing the discomfort, the answer was clear. The relationship would not survive. That wasn't a failure. It was information. Patterns don't tell you what to do. They tell you what is. And once Emily allowed herself to accept what was, she no longer needed to argue with reality. She didn't need to convince him. She didn't need to win conversations. She didn't need to be understood by someone who benefited from misunderstanding her. Understanding shifted inward. This stage was not empowering in the way people imagine empowerment. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet and heavy and deeply sad. Because seeing patterns meant grieving the fantasy that things could be different if she just tried harder. Letting go of that fantasy hurt more than any argument ever had. But it also freed her from endless analysis. From trying to decode every interaction. From wondering which version of him would show up. Patterns answered the question she had been circling for so long. Is this relationship capable of becoming emotionally safe? The answer wasn't ambiguous anymore. No amount of communication could change a structure built on imbalance. No amount of empathy could create reciprocity where there was none. Patterns don't lie, but they also don't rush you. Emily didn't leave immediately after this realization. Recognition doesn't equal readiness. But something fundamental shifted. She stopped negotiating with herself. She stopped minimizing. She stopped pretending that one good moment erased 10 painful ones. She began trusting the evidence of her lived experience. And in doing so, she reclaimed something essential. Her authority over her own reality. Patterns are not the end of the story. They are the turning point. They don't demand action. They offer clarity. And once clarity takes root, even the most entrenched dynamics begin to lose their power. Because when you stop arguing with what you see, you stop disappearing inside it. You begin, quietly and steadily, to come back to yourself. Reclaiming the self. Healing without becoming bitter. Healing did not arrive for Emily as a dramatic release. There was no moment where the past suddenly loosened its grip and everything felt light again. What arrived instead was something quieter and far more unfamiliar. Space. In the early days after the shift, after she stopped negotiating with reality, after she stopped explaining herself, Emily felt exposed. Without the constant effort of managing someone else's emotions, there was a strange emptiness. Not relief exactly. Not yet. Just stillness. And stillness can be unsettling when you've spent years bracing. She had imagined healing as empowerment, as confidence returning all at once. What she found instead was grief. Grief for the woman she had been before she learned to doubt herself. Grief for the energy she had poured into making something work that was never designed to hold her. Grief for the time lost not in years, but in pieces of herself she had set aside to survive. Healing began not with strength, but with honesty. Emily had to face a truth that felt uncomfortable at first. She was angry. Not just at him, but at the situation, the dynamic, the slow erosion she hadn't named sooner. Anger frightened her. She worried it would harden her, turn her cynical, make her unrecognizable to herself. But anger, she learned, was not bitterness. It was information. Bitterness numbs. Anger clarifies. The work was learning how to let anger move through her without letting it define her. She stopped trying to bypass it. Stopped telling herself she should be over it. Instead, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened without turning that pain into a worldview. Healing without bitterness meant resisting the urge to rewrite her story as one of foolishness or failure. It meant refusing the easy narrative that something was wrong with her for having stayed. She began to understand that resilience had kept her alive, but discernment would keep her free. One of the first things Emily reclaimed was her inner authority. For so long, she had outsourced her sense of reality, checking her reactions against someone else's responses, calibrating her feelings to fit a moving target. Healing required her to reverse that habit. When something felt uncomfortable, she didn't immediately question herself. She paused. She listened. She asked, "What is this feeling telling me?" At first, that felt radical, even dangerous. Trusting herself again meant risking mistakes. It meant tolerating uncertainty without rushing to fix it. But slowly, something remarkable happened. Her body began to relax. The tightness in her chest eased. Her breath deepened. She started sleeping through the night. Not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer at war with her own perceptions. Emily also learned that healing did not mean understanding him better. That door was closed, and letting it stay closed was an act of self-respect. She stopped asking why he did what he did. Stopped trying to extract lessons from his behavior. Those questions had kept her tethered far longer than the relationship itself. Healing meant redirecting that curiosity inward, not as self-blame, but as self-reclamation. Who was she when she wasn't anticipating someone else's reactions? What did she enjoy when no one was watching? What felt grounding, nourishing, real? These were not dramatic questions. They were practical ones, and they led her back to herself. She rebuilt her life in small, deliberate ways. Morning routines that belonged only to her. Walks without headphones. Journaling not to analyze, but to witness. Conversations with friends where she didn't have to translate her experience into something palatable. Community became essential. Not as an audience, but as a mirror. People who reflected her back to herself without distortion. People who believed her without needing evidence. People who didn't ask her to be reasonable at the expense of being real. These relationships reminded her of something she had forgotten. Emotional safety feels boring at first. It lacks the adrenaline of unpredictability. It doesn't demand constant vigilance. It doesn't oscillate between closeness and distance. At first, that calm felt unfamiliar, even suspicious. Emily had to retrain her nervous system to recognize steadiness as connection, not indifference. To understand that peace does not mean lack of passion, it means lack of threat. Healing also meant redefining strength. For a long time, Strength had meant endurance, staying composed, trying harder, absorbing discomfort without complaint. Now, strength looked different. It looked like saying no without justification, like leaving conversations that felt diminishing, like choosing rest over explanation. She stopped performing wellness, stopped rushing to be better. Healing wasn't a performance, it was a practice. One of the most profound shifts came when Emily released the need to be understood by the person who had hurt her. That desire to finally be seen, validated, acknowledged, had kept her emotionally entangled long after the relationship changed. Letting go of that hope was painful. It felt like giving up. But it was also liberating. Closure, she realized, is not something you receive. It's something you grant yourself when you stop asking someone else to confirm your reality. Indifference emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not coldness, not dismissal, just a lack of charge. His memory no longer hijacked her thoughts. His behavior no longer required interpretation. He became a chapter, not a question. This was the turning point. Healing without bitterness meant refusing to let the past dictate the future. It meant staying open without being unguarded, curious without being naive, soft without being self-sacrificing. Emily didn't vow never to love again. She vowed never to disappear again. She learned to measure relationships not by intensity, but by consistency. Not by words, but by patterns. Not by potential, but by presence. The self she reclaimed was not the one she used to be. It was wiser, quieter, more grounded, less impressed by charm, more attuned to her own limits. And most importantly, she no longer mistook suffering for depth. Healing didn't erase what happened. It integrated it. It allowed her to carry the experience without letting it calcify into cynicism. Emily didn't emerge untouched, but she emerged intact, and that after everything felt like the deepest form of victory. The new decoder: how smart women stay free. Freedom did not mean that Emily forgot what she had lived through. It meant she no longer organized her life around it. There was a time when she believed staying free required constant vigilance, spotting red flags early, dissecting behavior, guarding herself against every possible misstep. But real freedom, she learned, does not come from hyper-awareness. It comes from alignment, from living in a way that makes manipulation difficult to sustain. The new decoder wasn't about reading other people more accurately. It was about staying anchored to herself. Emily no longer asked, "Does this person like me?" She asked, "Do I feel like myself around them?" She no longer wondered, "Am I being too sensitive?" These questions didn't require analysis. They required presence. One of the first signs she noticed in herself was how differently she experienced silence. Silence no longer felt like a threat that needed to be filled or managed. It felt neutral. Sometimes, even comforting. When someone pulled away, she didn't rush to restore closeness. She noticed how their absence made her feel and trusted that information. Staying free meant allowing distance to speak. Emily also changed how she related to charm. She didn't reject it outright. She simply stopped mistaking it for character. She enjoyed connection without surrendering discernment, warmth without acceleration, interest without urgency. She learned that healthy relationships don't need to convince you of their value. They reveal it slowly, through consistency. Consistency became her North Star. Not consistency of affection alone, but of tone, behavior, accountability. How someone responded when she disagreed, when she said no, when she was tired, quiet, uncertain. These moments told her far more than grand gestures ever could. The new decoder was not reactive. It was patient. Emily also stopped over-explaining herself. This was one of the most subtle but profound shifts. She no longer justified her boundaries with long narratives. She didn't argue her right to feel what she felt. She didn't audition her needs for approval. She noticed something surprising. People who were capable of mutuality didn't require explanations. They accepted her limits without debate. People who resisted them revealed themselves quickly. Staying free meant allowing that information to land without negotiating it away. Another change came in how Emily understood connection. She stopped equating intensity with intimacy. The highs that once felt intoxicating now felt suspicious, not because excitement was bad, but because volatility no longer felt like depth. Depth, she learned, is quiet. It builds over time. It holds space instead of demanding it. Her nervous system adjusted gradually. She stopped mistaking anxiety for chemistry. She began recognizing calm as attraction. This recalibration didn't happen overnight. At first, steadiness felt unfamiliar, even boring. But as her body learned that peace did not equal absence, she found herself relaxing into it. Staying free required learning to tolerate that calm without self-sabotage. Emily also redefined strength. It no longer meant staying composed in the face of discomfort. It meant responding honestly to it, leaving rooms that felt diminishing, ending conversations that crossed into disrespect, trusting that she didn't need to educate someone into treating her well. She stopped trying to be the exception. This was crucial. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on exceptionalism, the idea that this connection is different, deeper, more meaningful than others. The new decoder dismantled that myth. Emily no longer needed to be special to feel secure. She needed to be safe. She also let go of the fantasy of repair. The hope that clarity, patience, or love could transform someone who consistently avoided accountability. That hope had once felt noble. Now, it felt unnecessary. Staying free meant recognizing when effort was being used as a substitute for reciprocity. Emily didn't become closed off. She became selective. There's a difference. She stayed open to connection, but not to confusion. Curious, but not accommodating at her own expense. Kind, but not self-sacrificing. She paid attention to how relationships felt in her body. Ease became a requirement, not a bonus. She listened when something felt subtly wrong, even if she couldn't articulate why. She trusted discomfort without dramatizing it. The new decoder didn't require proof. It required permission. Permission to walk away from situations that felt off, even if nothing bad enough had happened. Permission to choose solitude over relational strain. Permission to change her mind. Conclusion. What Emily's story really teaches us. Emily's story is not about a single relationship. It is about a slow, almost invisible loss of self and the quiet, deliberate return home. At the beginning, nothing looked dangerous. There was connection, depth, chemistry, and the promise of something meaningful. What followed was not overt cruelty, but a gradual distortion of reality. Emily didn't lose herself because she was naive or weak. She lost herself because she was intelligent, empathetic, and willing to reflect. The very qualities that made her capable, loving, and thoughtful were slowly turned against her. What makes her story so familiar and so painful is that there was no clear moment where everything fell apart. There was no obvious villain. Just confusion, self-doubt, and the persistent feeling that if she tried harder, communicated better, or became calmer, things would finally feel right. But they never did. The turning point didn't come when someone else validated her experience. It came when she stopped arguing with her own reality. When she noticed patterns instead of promises. When she stopped asking why someone treated her this way and started asking how she felt afterward. That shift from explanation to observation changed everything. Healing did not mean becoming cold, guarded, or bitter. It meant becoming grounded. Emily didn't harden. She clarified. She learned that love does not require self-erasure, that intimacy does not demand confusion, and that emotional safety should never feel like something you have to earn. Her freedom came not from decoding someone else, but from learning to trust herself again. The deeper lesson in Emily's story is this: emotional abuse doesn't always look like abuse. Sometimes it looks like overthinking. Sometimes it looks like being too sensitive. Sometimes it looks like endlessly working on yourself while the relationship stays the same. And the most important takeaway is not leave faster or spot red flags sooner. It is this: stay connected to yourself. Pay attention to how relationships make you feel in your body. Notice whether you are expanding or shrinking, whether you feel clearer or more confused, whether your voice is getting stronger or quieter. In your own life, this might mean slowing down instead of rushing into intensity. It might mean trusting discomfort, even when you can't fully explain it. It might mean choosing peace over potential, clarity over chemistry, and self-respect over hope. You don't need to become cynical to stay safe. You need to become anchored. When you stop abandoning yourself, manipulative dynamics lose their power. And when you honor your inner reality, you no longer need someone else to define it for you. That is how smart women don't just escape emotional abuse. That is how they stay free. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis or psychological treatment from a licensed mental health professional. Quick question for you. Which statement resonates more with you right now? A: I've often questioned my own reactions in relationships. B: I've learned to trust my inner signals, even when it's uncomfortable. Comment A or B below and let us know. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What part of Emily's story felt most familiar to you or challenged you the most? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from your experience too. And if this story helped you see something more clearly, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, honest content that opens conversations many people are afraid to have. One of the most freeing realizations Emily had was this: she didn't need to avoid narcissistic people to stay free. She needed to avoid abandoning herself. When she stayed connected to her values, her limits, her inner signals, manipulative dynamics lost their grip. They could still appear, but they couldn't take hold. Staying free also meant staying connected to others, not as validation, but as grounding. Emily nurtured friendships that were reciprocal and honest. She invested in relationships where disagreement didn't threaten connection, where vulnerability wasn't used as leverage. These relationships recalibrated her sense of normal. They reminded her that safety doesn't need to be earned, that care doesn't come with conditions, that love doesn't require shrinking. The new decoder was not a checklist. It was a way of being, a posture, a refusal to trade self-trust for proximity. Emily didn't live perfectly. She still made mistakes. She still misread people sometimes. But the difference was this: she corrected course quickly, without shame, without self-betrayal. She didn't cling to potential. She responded to reality. Staying free meant understanding that the goal was not to avoid pain forever. It was to avoid staying, where pain became the price of belonging. Emily's life did not become smaller after everything she had been through. It became clearer, quieter, more intentional. She stopped asking whether she was too much or not enough. She asked whether she was present, whether she was at peace, whether she was honoring herself. Those questions kept her free, and they still do. Not because she learned how to decode narcissists, but because she learned how to read herself. That was the final lesson, and it was the one that changed everything.